Good morning, everyone. The Moot Court Society of Law College Dehradun, Faculty of Uttaranchal University, welcomes you all for today's session under the banner of First National Online Lecture Series on Contemporary Legal Issues. This is the first lecture emphasizing on basics of constitutionalism. Today, we are delighted to have with us Ms. Aishwarya Bhati ma'am, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, as our guest speaker. We welcome you, ma'am. I also welcome Professor Dr. Rajesh Bahuguna sir, respected Dean, Law College Dehradun, and officiating Vice Chancellor of Uttaranchal University, and also patron of Mootko Society, Professor Dr. Rawat ma'am, respected Head of the Department Law and Chairperson of Moot Society, Law College Dehradun. We welcome you, ma'am. I welcome President, Vice President, members of Moot Society, and most importantly, all the participants who have come together for today's session. Before starting with the session, I would like to request our respected Dean sir to kindly introduce our guest speaker.
Okay, thank you, Yogi.
Pleasure, sir.
So today's keynote speaker, Ms. Aishwarya Bhati, presently Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, and HOD of Law, and now Principal of Law College Dehradun, Professor Dr. Poonam Rawat, also Chairperson of Moot Court Society, President Anna Anupriya, Vice President, Secretary, conveners, and of course, who is hosting this, Yogi Chaudhary and Rahul Kumar Sharma, and all the office bearer of Moot Court Society, and my dear participants from different university of the country and abroad. I'm taking this privilege to extend my greetings to all of you, and I welcome you all on the behalf of Law College Dehradun faculty of Uttaranchal University and on the behalf of entire university family. So you all are welcome in this webinar. Yogi has asked me to introduce Ms. Bhati, but I can tell you the introduction of Ms. Bhati is not new to anyone in this circle, those who are related to law and legal luminaries. But anyhow, Ms. Bhati graduated from KN College of Jodhpur. She did her law from JNB Jodhpur University, and currently she is practicing in Supreme Court of India since 1998. Ms. Bhati is seen very active in the bar also. She was elected Secretary of Supreme Court Bar Association for 2013-14 and 2014-15. Presently, she is also Additional Advocate General of UP government in Supreme Court and also on the panel of Union government. She has been recently gowned as a senior advocate in Supreme Court. We congratulate ma'am you for that first. And she has her experience in almost all the areas since practicing in Supreme Courts, and particularly she is known expert in the constitutional matter, and that is the reason that today she will be speaking on constitutionalism. I would like to share you, I'm very happy to see when I see that you graduated from Jai Narayan Vyas University Jodhpur, and fortunately I am also alumni of the same university. Long back in 80s, when I did my law as well as post-graduation from the same university. So now at point of time, everything is reminding in my mind that entire campus and so beautiful law department and rich faculty, all Professor Tiwari, Dr. Bhartia and all, I'm just remembering it. So it is, I'm highly satisfied to see you here, and With this, once again, I welcome you on the behalf of my university. Ms. Bhati, you are most welcome. I'm not taking much time, so over to Ms. Bhati. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm indeed extremely privileged and honored to be here, and it is wonderful to know that you and I are from the same faculty, the same alumni of the same law faculty. It is indeed a great privilege and honor for me to be present here, to be interacting with you all. In fact, I must congratulate your Moot Court team to have taken this challenge as an opportunity and having been organizing such webinars, such academic exercises in such periods of extreme difficulty and extreme hardship for the whole world that we are seeing completely unprecedented and uncharted times. And at such times, we all of us as students of law, you are the students are students in a different way, but lawyers and the teachers are also students of law in a different way. So we as students of law, if we indulge in these academic exercises and exchange of thoughts and opinions, I think it's a great exercise which you must all be congratulated for. I must thank Professor Saab. I must thank Dr. Poonam Rawat. I haven't had the occasion to meet you all personally, but it's great that we are meeting virtually. Coming to the topic that has been assigned to me, basics of constitutionalism is something that has been assigned to me today to speak on. Uh, I think I'm going to start with how our constitution came into being, because often the journey of the constitution has to be understood from the inception. It is often called as a bag of borrowings. It is called as a amalgamation of the best practices of the world. We have incredible features in our constitution. In fact, our constitution was the longest written constitution of the world till the constitution of Yugoslavia came, and then of course Yugoslavia broke also. But that is the feature of our constitution, and very important features we had taken from across the world, different constitutions of the world, best practices from across. Our fundamental rights is a chapter which is part 3 of the constitution. We got the major influence is from the US Constitution, the US Charter of Rights, and the Declaration of Human Rights, which was made by the UN body. In fact, if you look at our fundamental rights, they are so beautifully crafted that they are, in a way, they guarantee. It's an embodiment of the basic human rights which are available to all. The quasi-federalism, not sticking to a completely federal structure, but having a quasi-federal structure, was something that India took in deference to the UK system, and also in deference to the American system, which is completely federal. We have the system of emergencies. We have the system of the directive principles of state policy. That again is a very, very important chapter, because to have when our country was a newborn nation, as a newborn republic, as a newborn democracy, there were so many things that could not have been guaranteed to the citizens. But the aspirations of the citizens, the aspirations of our founding fathers as to the direction which the states should follow, is something that is there in the directive principles of state policy. And then we had the Constituent Assembly, which worked very hard. The drafting committee was headed by the architect of the Constitution, that we call him Baba Saheb Bhimrao Ambedkar. And the drafting was complete by exemplary women and men from all walks of life. Mind you, they were not elected people who were in the Constituent Assembly. And but they enjoyed great respect and dignity of the society, and they came from diverse and very intellectual and academia of the country, as also from very diverse fields of life. And that is why we have this beautiful constitution that we see. I will also urge all of you law students to whenever you are in Delhi, please visit the Parliament Library and go see the original copy of the Constitution, which is actually kept in a helium box to preserve it in that library. I have seen it, and it is beautiful, and you get goosebumps when you see as students of law, when you see the Constitution, it is an incredible feeling, because you get the feel of the real document. And often we forget that our Constitution was not just in written letters. Our Constitution, after the text was complete, it was actually Nandalal Bose and his disciples in the Shanti Niketan, who actually decorated our Constitution. All pages of it with beautiful calligraphy, it was written, and all the pages contain very, very beautiful images and pictures which depict the rich cultural heritage that we inherit. Though we may be a new country that was being born as a republic, as a democracy, but we continue to be a civilization which is thousands of years old, a culture, a mix of traditions, which is a part of who we are. And it is that culture, those traditions, which actually form the part of the beautiful pictures that we see in the Constitution. And they go from Ramayan period to Mahabharat period, to Bhagwan Shri Krishna giving the Gita Gyan to Arjun, to the times of Akbar, to the times of Rani Lakshmi Bai. It has Dandi March of Bapuji there. It has scenes from the Vedic period. It has scenes from the Harappan civilization. It is extremely beautiful with the original pictures, and I will commend all of you to have a look at it. In fact, the soft copies of it are available on the internet also, when you want to see original the Constitution. So I will urge all of you to see it. Now let's come to the document that we call the grand norm of our legal system, the Gita of our Constitution, or the Bible of our country, which is the first religion for all of us as Indians, a document that we are extremely proud of. In the last 70 years, we have seen over 100 amendments to the Constitution, but the heart and soul and the letter and spirit of the Constitution remains the same. It is a very vast topic. Constitutionalism with our Constitution is something that we can speak for days altogether, but given the constraints of time, I have chosen some basic topics that so that I can cover the basics of constitutionalism. I think I'm going to start with part 3 of the Constitution, because part 3 of the Constitution is something that is in a way the core of our Constitution. Part 3 contains the fundamental rights in our Constitution. Now, part 3 is further divided loosely into 6 categories. Now, those categories are firstly general. The general is Article 12 and Article 13. Article 12 and 13 very clearly lay down that in fact the power of judicial review. Judicial review is something that is a basic structure of our Constitution. It has been understood to be so. But judicial review is a term that does not exist anywhere in our Constitution, despite that being the sole criteria for challenge of all laws on the touchstone of the Constitution. So judicial review is something that comes from Article 13, which very clearly says that all laws which have existed prior to the coming into force of the Constitution, or no laws can be made thereafter also, which in any way contravene or any way supersede or take away or abridge in any manner any of the rights which are there in part 3 of the Constitution. Then the second aspect is the equality rights. The equality rights are from 14 to 18. Now 14 is something that we all very clearly understand. It is equal protection of laws, that everyone who is in India enjoys equal protection of laws. I must pause here and explain a little bit, because I found it as a student of law very, very interesting and fascinating that we understood the equality in the terms of from the Bill of Rights of the United States. Now, United States at that point in time was itself suffering and struggling with the idea of equality. It is such an interesting point that India took equality concept and the concept of liberty from there, but we were very careful, at least our founding fathers were very, very careful in not taking the negatives that were persisting in those countries. America was still struggling with gender justice. America was still struggling with the problem of the racial discrimination between the whites and the blacks, it was very, very rampant. It was very prevalent in the society. And at that time, even what we think America is a perfect example of the developed country, but even America understood equality between the blacks and the whites to understand it as segregate. So there were, the blacks were not allowed in the same schools, they were not allowed in the same hotels, not in the same restaurants, but what they were allowed separate restaurants, separate schools, and they used to consider it as equality. Now look at the beauty of our constitution, that when we took the concept of equality, not only did we say that everyone will be entitled to equal protection of laws, but we took it a step further and we said that equality means equal treatment of equals. And the constitution recognized the concept of affirmative action. The constitution recognized that there are classes of people who have suffered inequalities for so long, for centuries altogether, that if you put them at the same pedestal with the rest of the citizens, then it will actually amount to equal treatment of unequals. Because of their historical background, they are unequals. Therefore, the concept of affirmative action in Article 15 for women, for children, enabling and empowering the states to make special laws for the women and children, and also for scheduled tribes, for scheduled castes. Thereafter, the economically, the socially backward classes, economically backward classes. These were all categories that were identified by the constitution makers for affirmative action, so that affirmative action could be taken for their. And that is why you see, that these are all the special laws that have been made, especially for women. From dowry laws to the cruelty laws, to the domestic violence protection laws. These are all framed under this affirmative action empowerment that is given in our constitution. The second aspect is the second sub part of part 3 is the freedoms, the right of freedoms that we so strongly cherish in our country. Often we feel that we sometimes we feel that our freedom of speech and expression is so beautifully preserved and protected in the constitution that sometimes we sort of take it for granted. And in fact, here I must also pause and say that there is probably a time for us now to understand that along with our rights, we also have legal responsibilities. The present Chief Justice said it at a very at a forum in a public speech. He said that the freedoms, all the freedoms and all the fundamental rights have corresponding duties, and those fundamental rights do not exist in absolute terms. They do not exist in a vacuum. They have to be complemented and supplemented by fundamental rights of the whole community. And the Chief Justice actually said that if I have a right to move my hand however I want, my right to move my hand stops where whoever is sitting next to me, my colleagues, nose starts. So in the assertion of my right that I have a right to move my hand, I can't be saying that I have a right to hit his nose, because I have a fundamental right to move my hand. So that is something that we need to understand along with the freedoms, which are very strongly guaranteed now. Article 19 guarantees us all these freedoms of speech and expression. The freedom of press is also something that emanates from this. It is not specifically provided in our constitution, unlike some other constitutions, but the judgments of Supreme Court have read the freedom of press into the freedom of speech and expression. Then we have freedom of freely moving about anywhere in the country, the freedom to forming associations, freedom to pursue any profession, any livelihood, any service that we want to pursue. And these are very basic human rights, and they have been very strongly protected in the freedoms that are available, of course. The rest of the sections are with regard to double jeopardy, and then comes the most important article, which I feel is an article which has which has received the most expansive interpretation by the Supreme Court, which is Article 21. Now, Article 21 is something that guarantees everyone the right to life and the right to personal liberty. The journey of this article itself is a whole lecture in itself. It's a whole different topic in itself. We have thousands and thousands of pages of judgments which expand the scope of Article 21. But I must give you some examples here, because Article 21 initially was understood as just if there was a procedure established by law, because Article 21 says that nobody will be deprived of their life or personal liberty unless without any procedure established under law. So initially it was understood that if a procedure is laid down in the law, then it is fine. It was a strict interpretation that was given to Article 21, that if the procedure is there, then life and liberty can be taken away. The Menaka Gandhi's passport case was the case that became a turning point for this interpretation. And that we all know the facts of it, that her passport was impounded by the passport authority, stopping her from going abroad. And on her challenge, the passport authority very matter of factly said, well, we have a procedure here and we followed the procedure and we've taken it away. That is when in the interpretation, the Supreme Court of India actually used the interpretation of the US Supreme Court of due process, that the procedure has to be not just a bare procedure, but the procedure has to be fair, just, and reasonable. Now, this test of something to be fair, the procedure itself and the law itself to be fair, just, and reasonable, was read into Article 21, expanding its scope. Then we see Article 21 also became almost a very expansive umbrella for protection of rights for people who were marginalized. It became the focal point for all environment-related litigation, where we saw that there was massive destruction of environment that was being done by illegal mining, by destruction of nature. We saw at some point in time the ministers who were in power changed the course of the river to support to support a particular tourist resort that had been created by that particular minister. And the Supreme Court not just struck it down completely, but laid down, called it out as something that amounted to rape of the rock. And they said that the principles of the three Trinity principles of environmental law, which is the sustainable development, polluter pays, and sustainable development, polluter pays, and precautionary principle. These are the three Trinity principles that of environmental law that were also included in Article 21. Supreme Court said that it cannot be a mere animal existence, which can be life. Life means life in all its spirit and purport, life with the dignity of living life as a human being. It cannot be without that dignity. And then education was basic education was included in that, and rights of under trial prisoners was included in that. In fact, the whole concept of public interest litigation started from here. Now, public interest litigation is actually, I kept it as another topic, but I'll speak about it here only, because public interest litigation is, we know it very commonly. I mean, it's very prevalent in India. But we must understand that traditionally, law has a principle of locus standi, which means that if I have a problem, I can go to court with that problem. I can't go to the court and say that one of my colleagues has a problem unless the colleague is of unsound mind or inhibited in any way, or a minor or anything like that. So the locus standi is a traditional concept of law which binds and is prevalent in jurisdictions across the world. But in India, the concept of public interest litigation was coined by our stalwart judges in the 70s, in the early 70s. And we must understand why that change happened, why a departure was made from a well-settled and well-established principle of law, was because otherwise the fundamental rights for a huge majority of people who were leading impoverished lives, who had severe problems for access to justice, their fundamental rights would have remained a mirage if the concept of public interest litigation was not coined by our Supreme Court. To give you some examples, in the case of Hussain Ara Khatun, there was a case of under trial prisoners, who thousands of them who were languishing in Bihar and as under trial, so their trials were not complete, but their incarceration, which is their period of imprisonment, they had undergone so much incarceration that even if the trial would have convicted them, then also their maximum sentence they had completed, and they continued to be in incarceration. So who could have taken the cause of those under trial prisoners? Public interest litigation was the only way. Another example is the minor children who were used as labor in the toxic factories of Shivkashi. We all know that the crackers, of course, before the Chinese crackers came. Now I think we will have to go back to our indigenous crackers when Diwali comes. But the cracker factories of Shivkashi was using minor children because they were available as cheap labor, because they could be exploited, because they could be oppressed. So they were used and abused in toxic factories, causing long-term damage to health of these young children, and that also was taken up as a public interest litigation. It's a long journey from environment to basic human rights to, but I must also bring you to the journey of PIL that exists today. We have seen that public interest litigations, though at that time was a very noble cause, but public interest litigation through the years has somewhere become publicity interest litigation. It has somewhere become, a covert attack on issues that you don't want to take up. So, in the garb of environmental issues, you want to attack a compatriot who's running a business or a industry or anything on some flimsy issues. So that is the reality that is happening. Or during the COVID times, we have seen that we had such flimsy PILs that came to be filed asking for mandatory COVID-19 test for all citizens of the country, or absurd request. Anyone who had any idea or any plan of how governance should be run was coming to the Supreme Court or high courts with public interest litigations, which were mostly like publicity interest litigations, and not to really safeguard the interests of the oppressed class of people, but just to have private gain or publicity gain. We also must understand that when public interest litigation was coined at that time, the India of that time, the access of justice for a large majority of people was extremely difficult. Today, with our statutory system of legal aid, where legal aid societies and legal aid clinics have expanded through the length and breadth of the country. In fact, now there is a legal aid committee which is there with every district court in every district of the country, which provides free counseling on most of the issues, which provides free legal aid and assistance and matters and lawyers and everything from court fee to lawyers to everything is paid for people who are below a certain economic class. Also, specific offences with regard to women and children, irrespective of the economic capacity, free legal aid is available to everyone. So that is the extent of access to justice available today for everyone, and therefore maybe it is time for all of us as students of law to rethink or at least deliberate on the usefulness of the public interest litigations. Coming back to part 3 of the Constitution, the next right is actually again I'll have to go off course a little, because the Article 21A, which was added much later, and it is a very recent amendment to the fundamental rights. In fact, a new fundamental right was created, and you all know what I'm talking about. This is the right to education, which ensures that it will be the state's responsibility to ensure free and good education to everyone up to the level of 8th class. And then we saw the entire regime and the entire statutory framework changing about it for coming of the Right to Education Act and the entire paraphernalia around it. But what is significant for us as students of Constitution is to understand that right to education is one very peculiar right which has made a transition from directive principles of state policy to fundamental rights. That is how our founding fathers wanted it to be. Unfortunately, not many of our directive principles of state policy have traveled from that part to part 3 of the Constitution. But directive principles of state policy is part 4 of the Constitution, and it has, though a lot of statutory law has been made around that, but for a right to move from directive principles to fundamental rights, the very interesting example is of right to education. Now, the right to education is also part of the life articles in the subclause in part 3. The next set of rights is rights against exploitation. Now, this rights against exploitation is also something that we thought of not today. Today we are sitting in 2020. The world has changed around us. But look at the time when the world was grappling with racial discrimination. We laid down rights against exploitation, banning, making it unconstitutional, making it a fundamental right that nobody will be exploited on account of any race, gender, class, sex, and there will be specifically there was a prohibition of children in factories, and human trafficking and forced labor was completely banned. Now, India was also suffering from this. It is not like this was a concept only in the West. No, we had this as a social evil very, very prevalent in our society, where the forced labor was actually so rampant that it became a bane for the society. So our constitution makers actually took it from there and made it unconstitutional in that way. The next set of rights is the rights regarding freedom of religion. Now, these are rights from Article 25 to Article 28 of our Constitution. What is extremely interesting about these set of rights, we have to now touch into the concept of secularism. So, what I'm trying to do while I'm taking you through this journey of our fundamental rights in part 3, I'm also touching on the basic constitutional principles which are coming along with this. Now, secularism is something that was not that did not exist in our constitution initially when it was framed. It was added subsequently by way of an amendment. In fact, secularism was added. The part 4A, which is the fundamental duties, were added, and secularism was added in the preamble of the Constitution. So the question came, whether we were a secular country before this, or whether we became a secular country only after the amendment in the Constitution. This question has been very beautifully answered by the Supreme Court in several cases now, and they have very beautifully analyzed the principles and the thread through our constitutional ethos and constitutional morality to say that when state has no religion, when religion has been protected for all in the country, when there are special rights which are given to minorities in the country. So adding secularism in the preamble was just making it obvious what was already inherent in the Constitution. So this set of rights which are with regard to freedom of religion have to be understood in that background, that we cherished and nourished a culture which is a part of our culture, that we of accepting of amalgamating everyone, all religions, all walks of life, and truly emerging as unity in diversity, which is one of the biggest strengths of our country and one of the biggest principles for our constitution, which protect and shine this beautiful concept which is a part of our existence. I think we also must understand that by giving everybody the right to practice, profess, propagate their their religious rights and practices as a fundamental right in a country, and also at a time when the British Constitution, there is still a debate going on. Of course, the British Constitution is not a written document at all, but it is a set of charters, and it is a set of pronouncements and interpretations that has been given. But we, having interpreted that common law, the common law legal system and jurisprudence, or most of our laws, in fact, the most basic of our laws were made in the British era. And under the British era, we were unified as a single criminal code, as a single Indian penal code. Despite having that background and that baggage, the British Parliament, the British Constitution, the debate is now again raging whether they are a secular constitution, because under the British Constitution, the church is supreme, and the head of the state cannot be anybody who does not have allegiance to the church. So that being the position of the British Constitution, and Britishers claim that their constitution is secular, that they have freedom for all. But as soon as you have a special affinity for one religion, as soon as you make church as a central pivotal point in the governance, then secularism actually becomes a lip service. Whereas on the contrast, in India, it was actually secularism in its correct terms, in its wholesome terms, in its comprehensive terms. And also, we look at our background. Of course, there is a whole debate about the CAA that is raging, but we must understand how beautiful our culture and our tradition and history has been. Parsis, who were taken as, who are today taken as Indians who have tremendously contributed to the success of our nation as a singular community. We have had some very great Parsi gentlemen in all walks of life, and stalwarts like Jamshedji Tata and many other in the legal fields. We have, of course, legal fields has been filled with stalwarts, right from Palkiwala to Sorabji to Nariman. We've had many, but the Parsis came to India persecuted and thrown out from their own country of origin. When Iran threw them out, they came to India, and India not only, see, giving somebody shelter and giving somebody asylum in your country, but telling them that you have to follow our religious beliefs. You can't be following your religious beliefs. You've come here, okay, we'll give you place, but we will not allow you to have your religious beliefs. That is different. On the contrary, India has had the culture of giving shelter, of giving asylum, of opening arms for people from different religious places, and giving them places to have their own religious identity, their own religious culture intact, and the freedom to practice it, profess it, and propagate it in a free manner as a fundamental right. India is probably also, I must remind you, often we forget that India is one of those extremely rare countries where we have a government in exile running for over last 50 years of a very strong religious sect, which originated, of course, in India. I'm talking about Tibet. Dalai Lama in McLeodganj, Dharamshala, is running a government in exile for the last 50 years. And if India was not open or not accepting, then we could not have seen these kind of things. Also, the times of partition, of course, most of the young students would only have seen movies about it, or documentaries, or programs about it. But the mass migration and the persecution of minorities that happened, and the bloodbath that our country saw when we divided into two nations. But despite that, the nation that separated from us chose to be a religious nation, and we chose to be a secular nation, protecting religion and all culture, and that has been our strength. Let's make a comparison. I mean, now that we are talking about our neighbor who's almost like a twin brother to us when we talk about a republic democracy, that nation in the last 70 years of its existence as a free nation, what is a very interesting data about that, we have all seen how coups have been raised, and how governments have been taken over time and again, how democracy comes and goes in that country. But one data which I found to be extremely shocking was that in the last 70 years, no head of the state of of Pakistan who was elected in office has been removed by election. I want you to pause and ponder at the profoundness of this data. No head of the state of Pakistan who was elected in office has been removed by way of an election. They have all they have been overthrown. They have been removed by a coup. They have been removed by some SIT consisting of army and some high officials, or they have simply been murdered, butchered. That is the history of a nation which chose to have, and it is, and I often narrate this comparison between us, our two nations, not for any other reason, but see that we started as twins, and because we chose to have different paths, look at where we stand as nations today. In India, we have elections, general elections after every 5 years. We have midterm elections every now and then. We have state elections every now and then. And we see, have we ever witnessed or seen any coup or any armed rebellion by the army? Have we ever seen any usurpation of power in the manner that we have seen across our border? No, because our democratic principles are strongly and soundly embedded. See, when we look at just our country, it is easy to criticize. It is easy to because we all aspire for better, and we should. We should not stop at what we have, but we should strive to achieve more. We should aspire more for our nation. We are today raising an issue about having freedom of speech and expression. But I again want to give you an example of another a great country, which is a great economic power, from where we have seen the origin of this virus also in the present time. You all know the country that I'm talking about, the big dragon. And that country, if they don't have a Google search there. They have their own search engine, which is controlled by the Chinese authorities. And there, if you search, if you were to, you all must have followed Disney characters. Of course, the youngsters know what Disney characters are. Winnie the Pooh. Winnie the Pooh is a bear who's crazy about honey. He's a very sluggish. He's a slow bear. He likes to do things on his own pace. He loves honey. But if you were to search Winnie the Pooh in China, the search will show you nothing. It will say that the content is barred in terms with the local regulations. You know why? Because media had compared the premier of China with Winnie the Pooh, that he's slow and sluggish and bear-like character, bear-like actions, and therefore you don't have. In India, we have such clear division of power. We have such a beautiful system of checks and balances. We have the three pillars have independence in their area of functioning. Our executive, our legislature, our judiciary, they have complete independence in their sphere of functioning. Do you know how the independence of the three fields is understood in China? In China, the concept that they say is, we also have freedom, we also have independence of powers, but in an independence of powers there mean one mother and three children. Now, three children are legislature, executive, and judiciary. But do you know who's the mother? Mother means the Politburo, the Communist Party of China. They control everything, and that is one mother under whom. That is why we saw. I mean, the Tiananmen Square. I'm not sure if the youngsters will remember it. This was almost 20 years back, but tanks fired on young students who were raising protests, pro-democracy protests in China, and that is how the country has really seen. And during the COVID times also, we've seen the doctors who were whistleblowers. They were completely eliminated. In what manner? Anyways, that comparison was important for us to understand that how our how it is and my opinion, my understanding, and my strong conviction is that it is this constitution of our country which has been determinative in our journey, which has which has really taken our journey in a profound manner and taken it forward. Well, I think I'm running short of time. I was told to keep it to about 45 minutes, so I'm just going to quickly rush through some of the other topics that I had highlighted. Um, I must also touch the last subtopic of this part 3 of the Constitution, which is right to constitutional remedies. After the Constitution was drafted, the chief architect of the Constitution, Baba Sahib Ambedkar Sahib, was asked a very interesting question, that what, in his opinion, was the most important article of the Constitution. Now, with 400 plus articles of the Constitution, the longest written Constitution in the world, and if you ask somebody who's made it, I mean, if imagine if you were to make 1 dozen dishes for eating for your family, and your family asks you which you think is the best dish out of this, then it is not possible for the person who has made it to assess it. But Baba Sahib said that, in my opinion, if I was to choose one, though it is a very difficult choice, but if I was to choose one single article, that would be Article 32 of the Constitution of India, because rest of the fundamental rights would have become negatory, would have been diluted if Article 32 itself was not placed in Part 3 of the Constitution. So access to justice, access to courts for vindication, for protection of our fundamental rights itself has been exalted to the position of a fundamental right. Some of the other topics that I had written down for speaking with you, I'll just quickly touch. Yes, there is one issue that has remained, though I have touched on most issues discussing through this. I have touched on the issue of gender justice. 100 years ago, in the developed world, women did not have adult franchise. They did not have power of voting. Women were treated as a property of their fathers before marriage and their husbands after marriage. But Indian Constitution gave gender justice, gender dignity, and gender equality from the day one. Women did not have to struggle for the constitutional equality. Of course, in practice and principle, we continue to struggle, but not in constitutional parameters. Then I spoke about the system of checks and balances. For that, I have to give you the example. Most of the times, the job of the Supreme Court of India is to be the chief arbitrator, interpreter of the Constitution, and to check that the executive and the legislature function within the parameter of the constitutionalism. However, sometimes it can happen that even Supreme Court fails. Let me remind you of one such example. In the 1975, when emergency was in place, of course, you will not have recollection of it, but you would have heard stories. People were just picked up from their homes, from their offices, from the roadsides, from wherever they were, from parks, restaurants. They were picked up and put in jail. They were not given any reason for their arrest. There was no cause given, and right to life was suspended by a proclamation which was made after the proclamation of, along with the proclamation of emergency. At that time, challenges were made across the country, and those challenges, actually the 9 of the high courts of the country affirmed those challenges, and they said that right to life cannot be suspended during emergency. No matter if there is emergency, but other fundamental rights may be, but right to life cannot be suspended. But in what is known as one of the darkest hours of the Supreme Court of India, the judgment of ADM Jabalpur was pronounced, and in that judgment, the Supreme Court overturned those 9 high courts and said that right to life can be suspended. And can you imagine, right to life to be suspended in a manner, and when Supreme Court was needed the most, that emergency, that was not a medical emergency like we are facing right now. That emergency was an emergency where fundamental rights, all of them were taken away, where right to life was suspended. But you know what? Look at the beauty of our Constitution. When the Supreme Court failed, then the legislature stood up, and soon after the emergency, they passed the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act. And now, as per that, even if we have any other kind of emergency ever again, right to life can never be suspended. They have made it inviolable by way of amendment. Now, conversely, when Shah Banu's case happened, then Supreme Court laid down that Muslim women are also entitled to maintenance under the CRPC. because we don't have uniform civil code. So our personal laws are how, our religion determines our personal laws and personal, specifically matrimonial rights and duties. But that is not the case here. I must also briefly touch the issue of basic structure. I know that this is a very vast topic, but basic structure was also one beautiful journey, which is a very fascinating journey for every student of the Constitution. And it starts from, and every decade it is a different journey. Initially, right to property was included in Part 3 of the Constitution. It was a fundamental right. But then when we were emerging as a new nation, we needed land reforms. We needed to abolish the jagirdaris, the jamidaris, the feudal structure, because land was held in very few hands, and thousands of acres of land was held, and landless farmers and tillers were cultivating that land. So the land reforms were brought in, and when land reforms were brought in, then then high courts were interfering with it, because right to property was a fundamental right. Therefore, to ensure that there is social justice to the masses of the country, right to property was removed from there, and from there started the challenge to the power of the parliament to amend the constitution. Of course, in the first challenge, it was affirmed, and they said that yes, the parliament has all the power and they can amend Part 3 of the constitution. Thereafter, in the next decade, in 1967, that was Shankari Prasad. Then in the next decade, in Golaknath's case in 1967, we saw that the Supreme Court reversed its view and said that Parliament has no power to amend Part 3 of the Constitution, because Part 3 gives basic fundamental and human rights, and that cannot be amended. But they employed the doctrine of prospective overruling, because if they would not have done that, then all land reforms would have become nugatory. So Supreme Court said, but prospectively, so this will apply prospectively. Then we saw the great judgment of 13 bench judgment of the Supreme Court of India in Keshwanand Bharti in 1973, where the doctrine of basic structure was evolved. And that judgment itself, I will commend all of you to read it, and read commentaries about it, read the account of lawyers who were representing the parties in that cases. It makes for such beautiful reading, and it is going to enhance your interest in the constitutional law, give you a very good perspective and understanding. I think for every student of law, it is mandatory to read the judgment of Keshwanand Bharti, though it runs into thousands of pages, but still, I think COVID period is a good time. We all have a lot of time at our hands. So that became a focal point, and after the basic structure doctrine, and very interestingly, at that point, the issue was also raised that, okay, if basic structure cannot be amended, then what is basic structure? But then again, Supreme Court said that if we say today what is basic structure, then it will not be a ratio decidendi, it will be obiter, because it is not necessary for determination of this case. So they left that definition open, and in subsequent judgments across the decades, they have been interpreting what basic structure means. One very small, with your liberty, I'm taking, sorry, it's a very expansive topic, but very small topic. One more aspect I have to touch is how beautifully dynamic our constitution is. The constitutional principles, the basic of our constitution, the fundamental features of our constitution cannot be amended. They are inviolable, inalienable. But the interpretation of constitution has been so beautifully dynamic, and for that I must refer to recent judgments. Triple talaq was questioned even in Shah Banu's judgment in the 1970s, because she was also a woman who was given triple talaq after 40 years of marriage, and she had 5 children. But Supreme Court only said that we should have uniform civil code, and that is the job of the legislature, and they should do it. And they left it at that it's in the directive principles of state policy, and it's unfortunate that it has not happened. Unfortunately, 70 years gone by also, and it's still not happened. Anyways, that's a separate topic. It will become too wide. But coming back, when the challenge happened again, 3 years back, the Constitution bench of the Supreme Court did not shy away in saying that we will leave it to the legislature to decide this. They struck down triple talaq as an unconstitutional practice and said that the gender justice, the gender dignity, and the gender equality does not permit such a abhorrent practice which runs counter to the fundamental rights to be allowed to be practiced as personal law practice. So you see, another example, adultery. Adultery, the definition of adultery in IPC was challenged in the 1970s also. They said that, initially they said that adultery is the definition is mindless, it's arbitrary. Actually, it's mindless. If you see the definition of adultery in the IPC, it made sexual intercourse with a woman without the consent of her husband, consent or connivance of her husband as an offense. So if the accused had taken consent or connivance of the husband before having sexual relations with the wife, then it was not an offense. See how absurd it was. So it was challenged. It was struck. It was not interfered with. It was challenged again on another ground by saying that the woman, if this is happening with her consent, then she also must be made an accused as an abettor. But again, the concept, that understanding was that no, we will not interfere. But again, 2 years back, we saw that that same concept of adultery was again brought to challenge before the Supreme Court. And the constitution has not changed. The definition of adultery has not changed, but the dynamics of interpretation has changed. And the Supreme Court this time, and interestingly, it was the son of the same judge who was the author of the earlier, who was on the bench in the earlier judgment in the 70s. And this time the son was on the bench and he became instrumental in striking down adultery. There's a very beautiful saying in constitutional law that fundamental rights are like empty vessels. Every generation fills those empty vessels with the wisdom of its own generation, with the understanding and the experiences of its own generation. So we don't know how it is going to go forward, but the beauty of our constitution is that its interpretation is so dynamic that every generation can define it again and redefine it on the basis of the dynamics of that generation. I think I've covered some of the topics that I thought of. I've taken more than the time that was assigned to me. I'm grateful that you were all patient. We can have questions, answers if there's any time left. I'm really sorry for for overshooting.
It's okay, ma'am. Thank you for your thought-provoking session. We have some of the questions which I would be putting forward. Please answer them. The first question is, as we are aware that you got victory in the recent Babita Punia case. So with regard to that, I would like to ask you that what is the constitutional validity of Section 12 of Army Act, which makes women ineligible for employment in Army? Even if Parliament has power under Article 33 to restrict their fundamental rights, can it restrict fundamental rights to that limit that even it can discriminate people of the same class?
So, Yogi, Army military services form a separate class. We often don't realize it, but under Article 33 of the Constitution, a lot of their fundamental rights can be modified, can be an Army Act, Air Force Act, Navy Act. These acts are actually in exercise of the powers of the state under Article 33, which give the states the power to modify rights of certain rights, not all rights, but certain rights of the forces. But in the Babita Punia's case, the issue was not with regard to validity of of Section 12 or 13 of the Army Act. Actually, the Army itself had opened commissioning of women in its 10 arms. They were not taking women in the combat arms, but in 1991-92, on an experimental basis, they started taking women in the Army, Air Force, and Navy. But it was experimented. It was to be for 5 years. They extended it for another 5 years. Then they extended it for another 14 years, another 4 years. So total became about 14 years. But they were not granting them permanent commission. So this battle was about permanent commission, that if women are good enough for short service commission, if they're good enough to serve for 14 years, then they are good enough to serve for the pensionable service also. Then they are good enough to serve up till superannuation also. See, Army is not everybody's cup of tea. It's not like all women can be great Army officers. But it's equally true for men. Not all men can be great Army officers. We all have our aptitude, attitude, suitability, our competence. But then once women have proven themselves, if they have been excellent short service commission officers, then to deny them permanent commission and to deny them command roles on flimsy grounds is something that was an issue here. And the Supreme Court, I'm very honored that I was part of this journey. And the Supreme Court has come down heavily on such practices and said that the constitutional principles do not permit the state to discriminate on such flimsy grounds. And if women are good, you can't discriminate them on the ground of sex. Whether it is a man or a woman, her suitability, his suitabilities should be the issue.
Oh, thank you, ma'am. The next question is, from recent incidents over the anti-defection law, can we say that this law has succeeded in meeting its intended objective?
See, politics is a completely different ball game, Yogi ji. We have to understand that the purpose of defection law was actually to ensure, that you don't have defections which are smaller. But at the same time, if there is loss of trust in the leadership by a substantial number of people, then there is a legal way, a legal regime that is available for those people to legally defect and merge with anybody else or form a different entity without being disqualified to be serving in the house. We have seen there are lots of ills and evils and problems of our democratic system also, though as a whole our democratic system is very robust. When I was making that comparison with Pakistan, it is very clear that, and other countries also across the world, our democracy is amongst one of the soundest democracies and the most robust democracies of the world, and that is why it is respected so much. That is why we have so much of business activity happening here, because we don't have the uncertainties of non-democratic countries or fragile democracies of the world. Now, the defection, horse trading, these are some of the problems that we have been grappling with. Some laws have been made. I'm not really certain if the laws have completely served their purpose. I'm not sure if defection law has completely served its purpose. It's work in progress. It's work in progress, Yogi ji. That's all I can say.
My next question is, ma'am, can you share your views on Article 31C of the Constitution as to enforce certain DPSPs?
Yes. So Article 31C, which was also added subsequently, this provided that certain laws which were to give effect to directive principles, they will not be challenged in the court of law at all. But I must tell you that Article 31C was also challenged in the court of law, and because if you see the language of 31C, it is in very absolute terms that that you don't have to go into the cause and effect of the law. You have to just, if the law has a declaration that this is in pursuance of the directive principles of state policy, then that declaration is alone that bars the judicial review of the court. But thankfully for us, this scrutiny, this bar from the scrutiny of the court, whether it was by way of Article 31C or it was by putting laws in the 9th schedule. Now, 9th schedule was also something that is akin to this. That the 9th schedule was made initially again for the land reforms that were happening, because that was necessary for us to really develop as a country. But then what started as a compartment which was kept away from judicial review and judicial scrutiny became the dirty corner of the legislature, where they were putting all kinds of laws. The purpose, if you see why a 9th schedule came into being, was only to protect the land reform laws. But then we saw everything being taken away to 9th schedule to take it away from the judicial scrutiny. The same thing happened with Article 31C. They said if the law has a declaration that it is in the furtherance of directive principles, then courts cannot scrutinize it. They can't even look at it. But I'm forgetting that judgment where it was, but it was very categorically held that if the courts will look into it. The courts have the power of judicial review. But if the law only has a declaration, but in effect it does not promote any directive principle, and if it violates any of the fundamental rights, then it will be interfered with by the courts.
Okay, ma'am. My next question is that under the concept of equality, sometimes special treatment to certain persons is given. But even when they come at the same level, when they come at equality, those certain special treatment are not taken away. Can you comment on this?
I think your friend is asking specifically with regard to reservation, doesn't want to speak about reservation. Well, reservation has been a vexed issue in our country. And initially, it was taken as an affirmative action, but it was only meant for a limited period. It has caused a lot of agony especially with young people who feel that their opportunities are taken away, and maybe at some level the creamy layers are very absurdly defined. Though in the Mandal Commission case of Indira Sahni, the Supreme Court did make it mandatory that it cannot breach that ceiling of 50 years. The creamy layer has to be identified so that the same people are not given the benefit again and again. And this is also, I mean, it's not gone away, but also uh, the social discrimination has also not gone away, that we can say that the India is ready, or a time has come for that position to be taken away. Yes, the creamy layer definitions must be analyzed, evolved from time to time, because even in those categories there are it should not be that only few families or few people are able to have the benefit of the affirmative action, and the large masses continue to reel under the historical social inequalities that they have been. So this must happen, but it has to be on a case to case basis, it has to be on a state to state basis.
Okay, ma'am. My last question is CAA violative of Article 14 as there is absence of intelligible differentia?
My opinion, now CAA is a completely different topic. You have asked me a question, so I will have to tell you. See, the classification test of intelligible differentia that you are talking about, in my opinion, CAA actually meets the classification test because it has intelligible differentia, and it meets the second requirement also, that it has a reasonable nexus with the object that is sought to be achieved. Now, I will have to explain this a little. Slightly vexed issue again. So, in our intelligible differentia means that when you are making, now Article 14 does not bar classification; it bars inequality. So, if you are making a reasonable classification, if you are now, what is the two category of people here? One is that category of people. First, we must understand that we are talking about three countries. Now, those three countries with whom we share a common historical culture and religion and background and traditions, those three countries are not secular countries. Those three countries have religion as their state religion, and that religion is Muslim religion. So, it is not a discrimination between citizens of India on the basis of religion. The two categories are people who are the majority in those three countries versus people who are minority religions in those three countries. You know, just before the lockdown, I think in November, there was a news that there was a professor of a university in Pakistan, a very well acclaimed and very liberal professor. For blasphemy, he was convicted and he was given capital punishment. You know, and this is not the first story. There are dozens of stories that come out from countries which are not secular countries, where religion is a way of life, where religion is a state sponsored. One religion is state sponsored. There, the persecution actually becomes also state sponsored. You know, in India, I'm not saying that persecution does not happen in India. In India also persecution happens, but that persecution is not state sponsored. Those will be individual cases of violence, individual cases of operation, individual cases of persecution. But in the court of law, that is not the way. The court of law, the state machinery, the authorities, they affirm the constitutional principles. So we in India cannot imagine the kind of religious persecution that religious minorities have to undergo in those countries. So making these two as separate categories actually amounts to intelligible differentia. And it is not for all times to come, and it's not like you are banning citizenship for other classes. There is other category of people who have to stay longer. This is a smaller window which has been made available as a one time measure for people who have been here for the last at least 7-8 years, and most of these people have been there for 20, 30, 40 years, and who are here because of religious persecution. Another issue is raised that there is all other kinds of persecution that is happening. Of course, persecution often happens, for various reasons, for gender issues, xenophobia, you don't look like me, racial reasons, employment reasons, caste reasons. Persecution can have many faces. But once the law has been made, which law actually, what is the mischief that this law is looking at? The mischief that this law is seeking to curtail is that people who have faced religious persecution, who are religious minorities in those countries, have a window which is a shorter period of stay which is available to them for seeking citizenship in our country. I don't think it bars the classification test or the intelligible differentia test, and I think it is on constitutional parameters, it does not suffer from any anomaly. But of course,
Okay,
that's my opinion as a constitutional student.
thank you, ma'am. And I can see that a lot of clarity has come in our thoughts by your answers. We thank you for this. With this, we come to end of our session. But before that, I would like to request our chairperson.
I have to propose vote of thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. It's my privilege to extend the hearty, very hearty vote of thanks to Ms. Aishwarya Bhati, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court. The way the topic is discussed today is exemplary. You have enlightened all the participants on the very important topic of the Constitution of India. You have surely challenged the intellect and brain of the young minds. My special mention and thanks to our alumni, Sanpreet Singh Ajmani, Advocate Supreme Court and President of Youth Bar Association of India, for giving technical support to us. My sincere thanks to Honorable Dean Sir and officiating Vice Chancellor of Uttaranchal University, Professor Dr. Rajesh Bahuguna, who has always been a motivating and guiding factor in organizing productive events like this. Thanks to all participants from different universities and colleges. Last but not the least, my special thanks and blessings to Team MCS, especially Anna Anupriya, the President of the Society, Vice President Danish, Rahul Sharma for organizing this event, and Yogi Chaudhary, the moderator of today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yogi, can you allow me to speak for 1 minute?
Yes, sure, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Actually, this is out of tradition to speak after vote of thanks is given, but I cannot stop myself after I have gone through the entire speech given by Ms. Bhati. Right. So I believe that every good institution or scholars, they establish certain benchmarks there, and all these gurus are highly satisfied when these traditions are taken away by their students and applied in their life. So when I was going through the speech given by Aishwarya, then I could remember all the senior faculty members. I feel like I'm sitting in Jodhpur, and I'm sitting in Jodhpur in my law department, and sometime Dr. Bhartiya, sometime Dr. Mohan Kishan Vyas ji, sometime Dr. Tiwari ji is coming and speaking to me, and that I could not stop myself to speak on this moment. Aishwarya, really I remember those days and those traditions, and I am very happy and satisfied that we all are carrying that, passing that legacy. We are carrying those traditions. The way she started part third of the Constitution is the way which is inputted in our blood in that great university. So and she has not only covered the part third, but she has compared it with the other neighboring countries so as to establish where we really stand. That was the beauty of this lecture. And when we planned this series, and when Dr. Poonam Rawat proposed and we planned this series, that was for the contemporary issues and from the side of practicing lawyer particularly. And no issue can be more contemporary than CA. She has taken our CA and right to education, adultery, three talaq, every issue has been touched. And when we study part third of the Constitution, normally Article 33 is left over. So very let it be by way of one question, but she has covered the entire things. And those the question which were very tactical and need not to be discussed from the senior advocate like Aishwarya, she has given very proper answer to that. I am very happy to that. Aishwarya, I am also trying to carry that legacy. And as you said, if you come and you have to come to Law College Dehradun once, then you will find the replica of original constitution in my library, whatever you have described. And every student has privilege to see that. Not only this, when you will come here, I have arranged the rear photograph, all the founding fathers and mothers of our constitution in around 7 feet of the width, and that you will be find placed on our wall of the Law College Dehradun. That I am trying to do is, and I feel that if we are teaching constitution, that constitutionalism should be put in our blood, and we must understand the real meaning of secularism as you explained in your speech. So we are trying to that. Not only this, Law College Dehradun is famous for so many activities related to constitution. And the one is that our national moot code is always on constitutional. That is the moot code which is traditionally on constitutional. We are organizing everywhere in the month of October. One more thing last which I would like to convey, share with you rather, that we are celebrating Law Day. Normally, Law Day is celebrated with some speeches, seminars and all. But we have changed this concept and with the view to make this day meaningful for every one of us and particularly for the law students. We are organizing since last 11 years a mega blood donation camp on that particular day. And I'm very happy to share with you that units in thousands have been donated by Law College Dehradun, not one or two, in thousands. And government of Uttarakhand has awarded us not less than 7 times, including His Excellency Governor of Uttarakhand, for this cause. Right. And then whenever the student who pass out from Law College Dehradun, even senior student like Ajmani and all my students, they call me on Law Day and say, "Sir, abhi to blood donation camp chal raha hoga college mein." And I will invite you sometime. This is very unique scene or picture you will see where student in thousands you will find standing in line to donate blood, not one or two, thousands. And press has covered it lot many times. So these are certain things we are doing. And since we are from same university, so I could not stop myself to share with this. Someone may take it out of the contest, but I have taken permission from Yogi and we are sharing it. So once again, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Aishwarya, for all.
Thank you so
Thank
very
you, sir.
much.
Thank you,
It
ma'am.
was an honor and privilege for me to be here. And I now, by hearing so much from you, I
Lastly,
am
we cannot
fascinated
miss to thank
to come to Dehradun.
Okay, sure.
we cannot miss to thank Chitrangda ma'am for helping us to connect with ma'am and also with being with us throughout this lecture. So thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you.